This is why I say, again, like while I did make that distinction, I understand the anger that people carry. Good day everybody, Jack here with another reaction. I suppose that as a follow-up request to some of my reactions to the fellow electricians videos, or perhaps some others relating to history, some of you have been quite demanding that I react to a certain video that I will do today. And the specific video, in fact, is called The Fallen of World War II, the type of videos that is straight up made for turning on the waterworks. I do enjoy history quite a bit. I've stated before, I am quite the enthusiast on the subject, and especially when it comes to wars. I will say more specifically on like the scientific and also the like individual perspective. Traveling across Europe has given me the opportunity to, I guess, visit a bunch of museums and learning about like the common person story. But at the same time, I dreaded talking about the casualties because it's unsurmountable amounts of people, on both soldiers who heroically lost their lives, and some in some of the most terrible ways, but of course also civilians who stood the ground, and others who did not even get the chance to ever do so. So I think that sometimes it gets a bit sensible on my part, because it was truly gruesome. I'm gonna do my best here not to cry, but without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, this is by the channel Niel Haloran, so I highly recommend that you go and give this content creator a like in the least, and also subscribe if you would want to. That being said, let's go.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
That was the thing that I wondered about a lot when I was younger, as to why there was such a great influx of like movies that had to do with World War II. Yeah, I always wondered about that until I understood how important it was to record the stories of survivors and people who witnessed this firsthand, like from movies like much later on now, Dunkirk to All Quiet on the Western Front. Really amazing piece of cinema that give you like a bit more of an immersive feel of what it might have felt like. Of course, you have the whole Saving Private Ryan and so on. But of course, keeping this knowledge was super important, because if you've ever had German friends who grew up in Germany, you will know how they are thought about these things, right? The mistakes of the past that they should never commit ever again. And the reason as to why I say that is that you will often have people who bear a lot of resentment on certain people and don't know why. And as an example, in Japan, right, as a little bit of criticism on that part, you will be hard pressed to find young people of, let's say, millennials like myself, knowledgeable of what a swastika truly represents, because they are not taught about that. Older generation, sure, will know, because they lived through the restoration of Japan afterwards and the completely change in ideology. And I know, before somebody points it out, Japan does apologize all the time to its neighboring countries of the horrors that they committed themselves, but it is still important to point out.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Oh shit. Okay. Hold on, the video is 7 years old. It's still recent.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life.
Oh, it's looking
Whereas
like
military
that.
deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23.
Oh, that's wild. Think about that. In the UK, they would have conscription from like the age of 18 to 41. That did not mean that some people didn't go so far as to join at the age of 16 or so. Like you have some of the commandos, popular commandos were like 16 years old when they joined in there. Also part of the Royal Marine, the Royal Air Force as well. Later on, you had, I think, it was a joke that I made in my Command and Conquer. Oh, no, not Command and Conquer, sorry. What the hell am I talking about? The Company of Heroes video that in the US, for example, you'll be all the way down to 12, I think was the youngest person to join the Allied forces from the US side. 12 years old. Think about that. It's maddening. But of course, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there were women involved in the war still. I'm not just talking about the people who worked as technical engineers or in the factories to make more weapons. Like during the invasion of Slovenia, you had like the resistant forces or partisan forces there, where you had the likes of Albani, what was her name?
One eternity.
Albina Marie Josevar. Yes, that was her actual name. A person that you may not have heard of, but might likely have seen the picture of because of the scar that she had on her face that she received in 43 because of a landmine. Yeah, she was given a bunch of honors for that, but yeah, she was part of one of those groups who fought, a women group that fought during the Second World War on the Italian theater against Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, sorry, that was a stupid joke. There were a bunch of guerrilla women fighters there who were not just part of like attack groups but also engaged in sabotage. And then of course there was the Women's Auxiliary Air Force that employed such things as the Flying Nightingale that saved like 100,000 or so soldiers from peril. So yeah, they did contribute, but yes, the bulk of the deaths were from men.
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths. And we'll begin with American soldiers.
Oh boy.
Over
D-Day.
400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis.
Yeah. And of
About
course
a quarter were in the Pacific,
Pearl Harbor.
fighting the Japanese.
My God. Most of those were due to kamikaze. That's the wildest part of it.
When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war.
Yeah.
The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach,
Yeah.
where 2,500 Americans fell.
It's mad.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
Yeah. The thing that I somewhat accidentally came to learn about was during one of the few days, I think last year, where I was trying to put my daughter to sleep. And I had like one of the Miyazaki's movies going on, or Studio Ghibli, whichever one you prefer to say. I think it was My Neighbor Totoro, or it might have been something else. But we went from watching that and Netflix auto-played another one with planes. This one called The Wind Rises, which was like a fictionalized biography of a Japanese airplane engineer called Hiro Horikoshi. And yeah, he was designing planes for the Japanese army. Well, the details on his personal life are, of course, fictionalized, but more dealing with the same mentality that I guess some scientists had during the time of World War II. They wanted to make advancement in science, but not partake necessarily in the war. A lot of things that we will see being a sentiment, at least, that is reflected by a bunch of people across the world. If we're talking Soviet allies or then Japan. Yeah, essentially, it depicted just how faulty some of the plane design was. The type that would literally be set ablaze by just 2 hits. The sum of it all is that Giro's engineering ended up creating the Mitsubishi Zero fighters, which was the plane that dominated the skies even after the Americans joined the fight. However, as the Americans started figuring out the plane's weaknesses to compensate for the lack of resources because they couldn't manage to produce more nor engineer a better thing in time, they were then instructed to the practice of kamikaze. But as a surprising fact, just knowing how many lives they actually took by doing that is quite crazy.
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war.
Oof.
Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths.
Ah, boy, the Yugoslavian front just mounted. Holy shit. This is a part that I don't think a lot of people tend to acknowledge. Like, when people are usually talking about like retaliation against the Axis forces, we're thinking France, Normandy, right? Somewhat also in, let's say, the Red Army in Russia mostly. We don't talk much about Yugoslavia. They led perhaps the most successful offense against the Axis forces and practically liberated themselves. But of course, what it cost was pretty high. Like, I think we're about to get this, but like up to like over 1 million people at least died in just that coalition or kingdom of countries.
The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European War, was Stalingrad.
There's so much I would like to say about Stalingrad. Like, the whole situation is heartbreaking, but there is a certain level of admiration, at least for certain factions, that is to be put there. For some civilians, and also for, personally, at least for me, for scientists. But I'm gonna save that until we get to the other place, Leningrad, because that's when it gets a bit more interesting.
The German 6th Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Yeah. I wonder why. Joseph Stalin.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing
But at what
2.3
cost?
million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
Look at that. It keeps rising. Oh. When are we hitting Leningrad?
$8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military.
And that's the official, alright? That's the bloody official. Who says that it's not more than that? We know of the rampant censorship in documentation, especially to the thing that it did to their own people.
Highly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
Oh.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa.
Yeah, the Northern African campaign also doesn't get mentioned too much, because that one ended up, of course, being a massive failure on the part of Hitler. Okay, well, on Mussolini, if we are to be totally honest, because he was the one who gave orders, much like they did with Stalingrad, just ordered people to engage them at the front, not considering how the territory actually was. Yeah, he regretted that later on.
As well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis. Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
Yeah.
When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
Now, I want to make a point that might be a little bit, I guess, trivial for some, but I guarantee you that some other people never consider this. The distinction between Nazis and German. I know it was on a massive scale. There was a mass indoctrination of an entire people that made it very, very difficult for most of them to either refuse to take part in these activities or the bigotry that they had to concede to. But not every German were Nazis. Okay, I know it sounds very stupid to say, but there were resistant movements in Germany even all the way back as the time where Hitler came into power in 1933, where you had things like the political activists who did the activism through speeches so that it wouldn't be detected. You had film instructors and reviewers who would do the same thing. Young people who engage in the non-violent type of demonstration, like the White Rose. If you have like the equivalent, well, it's not quite an Anne Frank, that will not be quite right to compare her to her, but Sophia Scholl, if you ever heard of that name, she was one of, at least in the forefront of the White Rose, who was one of those anti-Nazi resistance group that unfortunately, along with her brother, was executed by the guillotine in 1943 as well. Yeah, fucking gruesome, man. Those fuckers, they were still making those kind of things. But the thing is that also soldiers, not just defectors who like later on, like certain battalions from Ukraine or other countries, France or something, that gave up and then joined the Allied forces or the Red Army to combat Hitler. No, actual soldiers who did not want to partake in the atrocities that Hitler wanted them to conduct. Like, that would be the equivalent of saying that every, let's say, US soldiers were like Democrats because Franklin D. Roosevelt was the Democrat president at the time, or that every Yugoslav was Serbian or something of the sort, or partisan, or instead of being, what was the guys in the mountains? Chetniks, yeah. it wasn't like there had distinctions being made.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps.
Oh,
Over
boy.
1 million died in Auschwitz.
Auschwitz, yeah.
Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp,
Yeah.
set up to look like a train station.
Some idiots, influencers went there to take pictures and... Oh my god, the idiocy that's on display.
Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
Oh. Okay. This is why I say, again, like, while I did make that distinction, I understand the anger that people carry. That also explains exactly why the retaliation in the POW camps after capturing some German soldiers was so severe. Because, man, the acts that they perpetuated. Hopefully we're getting into a certain territory there with Yugoslavia where I can get to talk about some of the acts that both the Nazis and then the Axis allies ended up committing. For example, the fascist Croatians ended up doing. Because that, we're talking straight up ethnic cleansing on the second degree. But, oh my god, these are the type of pictures that should be plastered everywhere in those locales where you see like fucking neo-Nazis displaying themselves as showing some certain form of pride, because there's nothing to be had pride of here. There's no pride in doing this. Fucking ridiculous. I'm sorry. This type of acts against humanity just...
Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Why does he have to look like the machine from X-Men?
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called gypsies.
Yeah.
The numbers are disputed.
LGBT people also. They have memorials of them in Germany. They also have memorials for the Soviet soldiers who aided in the combat against the Nazis. So that's commendable.
About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small.
Okay, so I know that I'm pausing a lot here, but this is simply to make a point that I found very annoying, because I had to help a student actually deal with a piece of paper that had something to do with this, as this is something that I do on the side. Usually it is for math and physics, but I usually also help them with history because, well, it's high school level, so it's not difficult. The point was that there was a postulate made by some kind of, I guess, clergymen here in Denmark who drew correlations to the Nazi party and their actions that were kind of similar to what the Soviet did by stamping out certain religious group and claiming that the Nazis were an atheist group, and thus saying that, yeah, atheism was bad, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, atheism is not a thing of moral compass, and again, you can be an atheist and being an asshole and also be a good person in the same way that Christianity does the same, despite whether or not your book tells you to do good things or bad things. That's why, for example, let's say black Americans were introduced to the Slave's Bible, right? Where only the passages that told about the submission and the instruction of how to beat or trick a slave were included in there, but none of those, let's say, like the New Testament claiming that you are supposed to treat your slaves well, were removed. Pure indoctrination. But in the concept of indoctrination, the Nazis were very much a Christian group who indoctrinated anybody who did not adhere to their way of Christianity. Funnily enough, they went first after the Catholic Church, right? Who are the ones who treat most other Christian groups as heretics. And this indoctrination, of course, was deep, especially for young children. A thing that they were tasked to do was often to report to even like high-ranking officers in the Nazi party for what they did in their families, at their schools, and especially also at their churches, because this was a pillar of the community, a place where you had to congregate with other people on Sundays and or on Wednesdays. That is also why groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses were struck pretty harshly, because they would use texts like the things from Galatians or Ephesians, perhaps, the passage about we are not here to fight a war of flesh, but against the evil spirit, something like that. I can't exactly remember the passage by mind, but they would use that to go against the conscription, which got a lot of them killed.
Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation. Some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad.
Oh boy. Here we go.
Now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be
Starved the people.
Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
Oh man, the casualties in there. This is where I mentioned the whole thing about the bravery of the civilians who stood their ground, and also that of the scientists, because it was a period where freaking Stalin had taken a bunch of the police and conscribed them to join the army, and the situation was so dire at the time, these policemen had to serve double duty. Not only did they have to combat the enemy forces, they also had to police their own people who were starving and committing crimes against themselves, like killing people because of just rations for rations. It messed up with them, with the morals, with the morale as well, and everything was just messed up. On the other side, then, when we come to scientists, there's one that I like to talk about when I get the chance, because not many people know about him. If the name Vavilov, oh wow, Pavlov, everybody knows about Pavlov, that's with the dogs, but Vavilov rings a bell, then man, kudos, we are friends. But Nikolai Vavilov was a famous, we can say philanthrope, he did that also in his life, but mostly botanist, who assembled, along with his team, the first world collection in plant biodiversity. Think of structures like the Svalbard seed bank, those structures that you will have seen in movies, like Stuck in Ice, where like you have like in the sci-fi plot where they are trying to save our future food supply and the genome of the human race. Yeah, those kind of things, but with grain. This man's goal was trying to stave away or completely eradicate hunger in Russia and then later on across the world. And his belief in a genetic was his driving force for it. But because of the usual Stalin and some of his lackeys not believing in his work, he was accused of espionage and sabotage while he was visiting Ukraine, was put in the Gulag and died there in 43. And yeah, his team, at least, the story that's important to this, safeguarded these vaults with their lives, had to keep the fire going, and did not touch any of the grain. So to keep the temperature and make sure that the grain did not spoil, and did not touch any of it. They died surrounded by food. And that was one of the craziest stories that you will ever come across. And this was all the while some resorted to cannibalism.
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers.
Yeah, we've seen a bunch of those. And then you have Denmark, almost lost nobody. Yeah, we played but a tiny little role, mostly in the area of Schleswig-Holstein, where people are still discussing nowadays whether they're German or Danish. Oh, sorry.
The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
And he means it when he says rapes. There was this weird myth, at least superstitious belief that Hitler had about... I think I'm pointing this out because that is one of the reasons that is always brought for it, that he feared the act of masturbation and, of course, venereal diseases. So what they will often do, at least I will know that from stories that I've heard in, for example, Yugoslavia, that they were kidnapped young women on the street or from their homes or whomever they could find from families and force them to work in brothels that they established across the countries. Yeah. And it's fucking gruesome. So I guess that was retaliation for their actions.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
22 million.
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater.
Oh.
Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
Of course.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Holy shit, let's talk about Nanking. Oh, and the POW camps. The death marches. The literal fucking death marches. Yo, Japan has succeeded in changing the image. Like, there's a joke that we sometimes have, at least when I get to talk with German friends, like, okay, so in Germany, what have you done regarding the war? Yeah, well, we told it to our youngins, younglings, Star Wars references there, I'm sorry. We told it to our young folks, and they understood that this is something that is never to be repeated. All right. What have you done, Japan? Nothing happened.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people.
Yeah.
Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
Whoa.
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks.
Yeah.
Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets.
They were. There's no denying that.
When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record.
Oh, wow.
Some of these are...
Yeah, fucking Stalin went so far. And again, a Mao Zedong being brought forth there. Like, while I understand also the state that Europe was in after the Great War, the fact that it resulted in having the rest, at least its sequel, being of such a ginormous scale.
They're more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries.
Yeah.
World War II had the highest body count, and
In
it all
such a short
happened in
time.
just 6 years.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's the most frightening statistic about that. Like, hell, I understand the Ming Dynasty's fault there, but like, look at something like the 30-Year War, where like most countries around like the Germany area there, what will later be the what's it called, the some of the Habsburg Empire and such, the Franco-Spanish, all of those had like a reduction of like 50% of their population. And that's just 7 million people who died. Now, when I mention such things as the women that partook in it, the children's conscripts that were, not conscript, but at least those who joined at the age of like 12 years old, just indicates that there wasn't a time or anything to spare. Like the Geneva Conventions were invented, yeah, but let's be honest, people are completely forgetting about those once shit really hit the fan. Like, there was nothing to spare there. Everybody was sent in there.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
Yeah.
But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening.
All right.
In 1989, John
Long
Gaddis coined the
peace.
phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used.
Yeah, well, there was an absence for nuclear conflicts, but there were conflicts. But I guess that they weren't of the amplitude of the Second World War.
Although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary.
Yep, and of course until recently with Ukraine and Russia.
When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though
But again,
smaller in scale.
The video is 7 years old.
And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Oh, that's a
To many, peace is too strong of a word.
colonial
Wars
wars.
have occurred since World War II.
Not
And they
anymore.
can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. we've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of two types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II.
It's a comforting thought to a certain extent. You know, as much as we see the bleakness in a lot of things, the way that some governments are not treating their citizens well, taking care of their health care, disregarding the plights of those who truly need it, and also at times even forgetting to address their involvement in certain conflicts in the past that hopefully do not lead to further issues. We are, quote unquote, living in the best time ever. The data shows it to us, despite what we might perceive to be otherwise.
If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring.
Yeah.
That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened.
Yeah.
We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
Perhaps. Ending on a hopeful note. I like it. Yeah. Please do subscribe to Niel. That was such a good representation. Like the comparative bar charts there is not always something that we get to see too often. Like we can understand or hear the numbers, and some of them feel ginormous, but when we adjust for certain factors, suddenly things make a bit more sense here and there. That was really good. That was beautiful. Nice that he touched on certain things that we might not have thought about too much, and hopefully I hope that my commentary, despite it, I know, dragging some time a little bit, divulge certain information that you might not have known. That being said, though, thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope that you liked it, and for people who watched it, that it provided to you with some new insight on certain things. I wish you all to have a wonderful day. Stay in peace, chill out, and see you guys in the next one. Bye.